So you're sitting on the couch and you're watching a classic movie, Secret Window. And at the end of the movie, you finally realize that Johnny Depp's character actually has multiple personality disorder. You then follow this up with another good movie, in my opinion, Split. And again, character is depicted as having multiple different personalities. And so, of course, you begin to ask yourself, is this a real thing? And so you go to Google and you look up, is multiple personality disorder a real thing? And of course, as with most things, unfortunately, in this world, you find out that there's a lot of misinformation out there mixed in and muddled in with the grains of truth here and there. So, because you're a listener of the science behind that, you decide to shoot Atticus an email. So let's talk about the science behind that.
Welcome to The Science Behind That with Atticus Hamilton.
Hello, all you scientists, and welcome on back to the Science Behind That podcast. I hope you are having a great Monday. I hope you had a nice weekend. I know I had a nice weekend. Kind of explored the archery ranges in the area that I'm living in, and they were interesting. So I figured I'd do this episode for you today because it's kind of an interesting episode, and hopefully it'll take you through the week until Friday. So as you heard, we're talking about multiple personality disorder, and if it's even a real thing. And before we jump into it too much today, I'd like to invite you to go get yourselves a nice hot cup of coffee, add a little maple syrup in it, and we will get started. So, this is a topic that I was actually talking with my sister about for a long time before I decided to make this episode. She had always said that, she thought that multiple personality disorder was just kind of made up, a catch-all that psychiatrists and psychologists like to just use and throw people in when they can't come up with another diagnosis for what's actually going on with the patient. And I always thought that was interesting. We do see examples of similar things in medicine, unfortunately. As a prospective doctor who plans to apply again to med schools next year, I think that it's a duty of all young doctors to research some of the worst examples of medicine so they know what not to do, But we've seen examples of this outside of psychology. Lobotomy, that was a thing that was pioneered not even by a doctor. I did a whole episode on that a long time ago for my Halloween special. So if you want to hear that, definitely go give a listen to that. That was a fun episode to do. But that was a long time ago. I think that was the first year I did this podcast. But anyway, so and other than that, there's a lot of other examples I can think of. In the early 1900s in Italy, they still had insane asylums. And I know I'm singling out Italy because these days they actually have pretty good mental health care, all because of one physician. His name was Giorgio Antonucci, and he was a neurosurgeon, but he advocated for talk therapy, basically. He's the father of modern talk therapy psychology, and he reformed the entire history, or the entire Italian psychological community, which was pretty cool. So, he's one of my idols. But anyway, getting a little sidetracked here. So during my research for this topic, I was it appears like this may be a similar sort of thing, as a catch-all. So before we do that as well, I just want to let you know, if you guys ever have any suggestions or comments or ideas for the show or episodes, please send me an email at thesciencebt@gmail.com. I'd love to hear what you guys think I should do. There's a lot more of you now, which is absolutely insane. I'm almost at 2,000 listeners, and I know for some podcasts out there, it's like, oh, big deal. But, I mean, that is crazy to me. But anyway, so let's get into it. So first, what is multiple personality disorder? Well, I hate to say it, but we all need to change our lexicon now, because multiple personality disorder has been renamed for some reason to dissociative identity disorder. So, Cleveland Clinic has a whole page on it, and they definitely seem pretty convinced that it's a real condition. So I'll just go through here, briefly talk about what DID is, or what multiple personality disorder is. For the sake of simplicity, I'll just call it MPD for short. So MPD is a mental health condition according to Cleveland Clinic. Generally, people with MPD have two or more separate identities. These personalities control their behavior at different times. Each identity has its own personal history traits, likes and dislikes. MPD can lead to gaps in memory and hallucination. So they talk about how common it is. It's very rare. It affects between 0.01 and 1% of the population. It can occur at any age, and women are more likely to have MPD than men. So here's the signs and symptoms other than the distinct personalities, right? So you have the core identity, which is, I guess, the person's usual personality, and then they have alters, which are a person's alternate personalities. Some people with MPD have up to 100 alters. I'd like to see the literature on that, but all right. And so other symptoms include anxiety, delusion, depression, disorientation, drug or alcohol abuse, memory loss, suicidal thoughts, or self-harm. So one thing I just want to point out right there off the bat is if you have a patient, right? So one of the symptoms here is delusions, right? There's a lot of different types of delusions out there, right? There's a lot of different types of ways that delusions can express. It's not just delusions. So, I mean, delirium you could argue is a form of delusion. So you can have somebody because they also say drugs or alcohol abuse, right? If somebody has OD'd on alpha PVP, which I know some of you are like, what is alpha PVP? Flakka is the street name of it, but the actual chemical name is alpha PVP and alpha PHP. Slightly different chemical formulas, same thing. But it was a big thing a while ago, like in 2017, especially in Florida. And one of the side effects of overdosing on alpha PVP is excited delirium, right? So there was an example of a patient who had overdosed on alpha PVP and was trying to break into a police station at 3 a.m. because he said that he was being chased by demons. There was another patient who was, I'm sure that we all remember this if we're from America, and honestly, this probably made it to world headlines, I don't know, a while ago. I think it was 2013. There was a person on the side of the road that was eating somebody else, and it was because he was tripping. He was overdosed on alpha PVP. And later he said, well, the voices told him to do it. And so this right here is something I have an issue with, right? If the diagnosis of MPD or dissociative identity disorder is just that somebody has a different identity and the other symptoms are delusions and potentially drug or alcohol abuse, then do those people who were OD'd on alpha PVP, do they are they now considered to have multiple personality disorder? So it's just something that I figured I would bring up because there's a paper that we'll talk about towards the end here, which highlights the biggest issue I see with this. But anyway, so Cleveland Clinic says, or continues to say, is there a test for MPD? And here's another, in my opinion, problem with this diagnosis. There isn't a single test that can diagnose DID. A healthcare provider will review your symptoms and your personal history and may perform tests to rule out underlying physical causes for symptoms such as head injuries or brain tumors. Symptoms of MPD show up in childhood between ages of 5 and 10, but parents, teachers, and healthcare providers may miss them. MPD can be confused with other behavioral learning problems in children, such as ADHD. And this is something that I'd like to point out too. Psychology is difficult, or psychiatrics is difficult. It's difficult to treat patients and diagnose patients in psychiatrics, right? Because a lot of our diagnostic tests are holdovers from the 1800s for some reason. And a lot of times there's no, working together. Like a lot of times you don't really have a psychiatrist working together with a neurosurgeon to say, hey, maybe there is, maybe there's a physical or neurochemical, cause for X disorder. And so because of that, you can end up having a lot of diagnoses that are subjective when you don't have a set framework of diagnostic tests to go by. And that can be, problematic. So anyway, so that's an overview of multiple personality disorder, or dissociative identity disorder. And so I think the natural question is, where did it come from? So I found this article by Psychology Today, and before you're like, oh my God, that's a terrible source, blah, 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 hold on a second, right? So this article by Psychology Today was posted, February 7th of this year. That's cool. By Joe Pieri, who's, I guess, a psychiatrist. And, he's talking about sort of the arguments and the arguments in support of multiple personality disorder and the arguments in opposition to it. And so he says that certain people, or that other physicians have suggested that the diagnosis of multiple personality disorder was manufactured by those claiming to have it based upon a blueprint established in the Hollywood films The Three Faces of Eve from 1957 and Sybil from 1976. I personally don't know what those films are. I've never seen them. But when you actually look into the literature of it, that's not accurate. Benjamin Rush is credited as being the first person to have mentioned something like MPD. And who is Benjamin Rush, you may ask? He was an American physician in the 1800s. He was born January 4th, 1746 in Philadelphia. Who really cares? But he was an American physician and philanthropist. He studied in Europe as a professor in chemistry from 1769 to 1789. And at the Medical College in Philadelphia the following year. And so why is he significant? He's significant because he was really one of the first people to state that mental illness is a disease of the mind and not a possession of demons. And that was a belief that was held during that time period, was that anyone who had anxiety, depression, anything really, any mental illness was just possessed by demons, so that's stupid. But Dr. Benjamin Rush argued that that was stupid and that it was a disease of the mind. Now, I couldn't actually find the papers that are credited to him where he talks about MPD. But from my research, according to University of Pennsylvania and the Pennsylvania Hospital, where he spent a lot of his time working, that is what he did. He was credited with mentioning that, and with, as it pertains to a very particular patient, Mary Reynolds, in 1811. And so the case of Mary Reynolds in 1811 is thought to have been the first known case of multiple personality disorder. So, who was Mary Reynolds? I hear you asking. So Mary Reynolds was in 1811, she was a somber Pennsylvania spinster, and she awoke from a prolonged sleep as a new personality. And so family memoirs describe her 18 years of shifts between two different personalities, and that sort of served as literally the framework for the following 200 years of arguments in support of multiple personality disorder. But it is stated that there is no mention made of childhood trauma, and that's important because advocates that say multiple personality disorder is real will state that childhood trauma is essential, right? In formulating multiple personality disorder. So it's not so much based on the environment, or not based on the genetics of the person, as we see with a lot of diseases. It's based on the environment, right? So that was the argument, but in her case, that was never found. Apparently, it is suggested that she experienced early trauma as a victim of religious persecution, which forced her family to leave Birmingham, England, when Mary was 8. And a review of her illness indicates it may have functioned to eradicate memories of traumatic early experiences, which could also lead somebody to ask the question, is it multiple personality disorder or is it PTSD? I mean, PTSD wasn't known back then. Again, you're talking about a time period where people thought that demons were the cause of mental illness. So it could be that she just had PTSD. And since PTSD wasn't discussed during the time that Dr. Benjamin Rush came around, he didn't have anything to point to and say, oh, yes, it's this. But the reason why we all say, oh, yes, it's definitely a case of multiple personality disorder is because this great physician during this time period said it was, so we all believe it. And some of you may, act like, oh, that would never happen, but it did happen in other examples. We believed Hippocrates' ludicrous theory of the four humors up until the 1900s for no reason other than it was Hippocrates. So, I mean, that wouldn't be the first time that something like that has happened, but who knows, I don't want to sway you one way or another. So, overall, what do we know so far? What we know so far is that the arguments in support of it are that there are cases, diagnosed cases of patients, excluding hers, right, in the 1990s and later by psychiatrists that state that patients have multiple different personalities. And these cases also state that these patients, 97% of them, have early childhood traumas. Now, does that mean that it's real? Well, let's start looking at the the evidence in opposition to the existence of multiple personality disorder. And this was hard. It was hard to find any modern research papers actually examining multiple personality disorder. Regardless of what the result was, it was just hard to find credible papers that examined it. But I did find one that was published in the British Journal of Psychiatry, January 2nd, 2018. And they basically said that, so they examined 5 aspects of the diagnosis and treatment of MPD, multiple personality disorder, and the following 5 conclusions were made. 1. The contemporary diagnostic criteria are vague and over-inconclusive. 2. The second recent alleged increase in prevalence of the disorder is almost certainly artifactual. 3. Legal proceedings involving MPD patients raise disturbing questions about personal responsibility. And this is very interesting. I know there's some of you out there that are lawyers. We're going to touch on a legal case that pertains exactly to MPD that is very interesting, I think. 4, there's little literature to support literature and support for the theory that MPD results from childhood trauma. And 5, many of the techniques used to diagnose and treat the condition reinforce its symptoms. And so they further recommend a careful revision of diagnostic criteria and analysis of diagnostic criteria. So ultimately, what are they saying? Ultimately, they're saying that there's very little literature to suggest that it is a thing. And they're also saying that the diagnostic criteria, which is what I said at the beginning of this, it's very vague and it reinforces the symptoms, right? So, what does that mean? It's like saying, if this person has a fever, that means that they're really hot because they have a fever. It's as ludicrous of a statement as that. It's just reinforcing the symptoms that these patients are expressing, as in the example of Cleveland Clinic, saying one of the other symptoms is delusion. Well, by definition, if somebody thinks there's multiple different selves living within themselves, that is a delusion. So, of course, a symptom is delusion. You see what I'm saying? All right. And so, continuing here, this is the last paper I found, and this was a legal analysis of a case that involved Kenneth Birinci. I can't say the last name. It was in 1979. A defendant who was charged with first-degree murder and suspected of having the disorder. So, the desired outcome for the prosecution would be the death penalty. And if he was convicted of first-degree murder, he would have gotten the death penalty. However, the defense argued that he had multiple personality disorder. And if that, succeeded, he wouldn't get the death penalty. He'd most likely be interned in a sort of mental institution for the criminally insane. Because keep in mind, this case was in 1979, and this paper was October 3rd, 1983, so it's kind of old, but it's very interesting. So, because of what happened, it was argued, so he did succeed, he did get the diagnosis of multiple personality disorder. But since then, what was argued was that there needs to be a differential diagnosis between MPD and malingering. And so I had to look up what malingering is. Malingering is basically the over-exaggeration or the manufacturing of an illness, particularly mental illness, to obtain some sort of desired outcome. And so it was determined that if a true multiple personality disorder existed, then the structure and content of the accessory personalities should have been consistent over time, right? So they wouldn't just change, and that's what they're saying here. They also said that they should have been stable and not altered by social clues, and they, and so none of that panned out. And what turned out, rather, was that this patient, Kenneth Barichny, his air quotes multiple personalities changed over time and changed in response to different social environmental factors. And the life history indicated a persistent pattern of conning and deliberate deception in this patient. And it was concluded that Mr. Bianchi was simulating a multiple personality, and the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder with sexual sadism was made. And so ultimately, what does that mean? Well, that was a high-profile case, and I don't know, maybe some of you lawyers out there that do listen to this podcast know about this case. But in my mind, that really, right there, solidifies, if not a big kernel of doubt in my mind of the existence of MPD. It definitely proposes maybe a new way to test if a patient actually has MPD, to see if their personalities that they claim they have are held consistent. So ultimately, in conclusion, what do we have here? We have a long time debate that still has yet to be put to sleep, basically. We have a debate that basically stems back all the way to the 1800s with Benjamin Rush, right? And we still have... And the thing is that the diagnostic criteria that Benjamin Rush laid out in the 1700s is still what is being used today to diagnose patients with MPD. But there's still a large branch of the medical community and the psychiatry community that believe that it's a legitimate thing. I, however, don't. I think that there is just too many holes to, at least at this point, say conclusively, yes, it's a real thing. And that being said, too, I don't know if we can say, no, it's made up. Because, frankly, there's very little research on it in general out there that I could find from trustworthy sources. So, I guess use your own judgment. Make your own decisions based on the data that I provided you and based on your own research. I encourage you all to, do your own research and determine for yourself if you think that the data is representative of a yay on the side of it does exist, or a nay, that it doesn't exist. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of The Science Behind That. I had a lot of fun doing this. I know I haven't done a psychology episode in a very long time. So, you were asking for it, and here you go. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I will see you guys all on Friday. Have a great week. Get through it. Do whatever you have to get through it. It's almost Friday. So I will see you guys all on Friday. Remember, stand up and question everything.